Welcome to a very special professional development episode. Today we have a gem at Greening Youth Foundation, Shatiba Bradley, who offers an up close and personal journey of what it means to go from NPS to NGO. Shatiba is an HBCU alumni, a GYF program manager of our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service programs, and was once the keeper of the key to Paul Revere's house. Through a diverse lens, we'll navigate multiple levels of the National Park Service and find out what it takes to successfully traverse federal and private sector careers.
So a little bit about myself. I was a biology major. I attended South Carolina State University, and initially I want to work in environmental science or maybe medicine. So I went to Howard University. I was a physician assistant major, and as I matriculated through my program and got closer to being a clinician and actually having hands on with my program, I realized that my spirit was pulling me back to environmental science. So I went back to school and I, by chance, was passing my career development, and I wandered in, and there was a guy that was dressed in a park ranger outfit asking students to come work in the Great Smokies. So at the time, I'd never been to a national park. So I accepted. My mom drove me there, and my first roommate, her position was a SEA student, and she was a conservation saving raccoons. So it was a very different experience. I met people who never met blacks, and this was in the 2000s. So it wasn't like 30 years ago. This was, in the last 15 years. But it was eye-opening because I was the only person of color. So to see what Green Youth Foundation does for people of color, it really resonates to me. So my travels, I finished that program and I went back to school with a new level of enthusiasm for the National Park Service. So I literally picked out a map and I began to put dots all over the map, the places where I want to go. So my next stop was Boston National Historic Site. So I told the story of Paul Revere, Crispus Attucks, the Revolutionary War, and it was very mind-boggling that literally I had the key to Paul Revere's house. So coming from a child from South Carolina, traveling up to Boston, it was really eye-opening. So of course I did that same process again. I worked at Boston African American site to tell the story of Crispus Attucks, and all the stories relating to the Underground Railroad, because that was one of the last stops before reaching Canada. The biggest take home for me is the Park Service does a great job in telling the story. So as I tell my story, it really it honed my public speaking skills. It made me be a better steward of the environment, and also it made me appreciate history. So that's kind of the take home. And of course, my travels continued on back down south, and I worked at Dr. King's house. And that was the end of my career as a front-facing park ranger. So then I kind of moved into management. But my take home, I guess, that what I learned as a student, because I was a student for most of those, was that you have to be diligent. The Park Service really wasn't doing a great job in how to take a student and make them into a permanent employee. When I worked at Dr. King's house, I worked with a gentleman who was 80 plus years old that marched for Dr. King, and he was the last permanent that was hired. So literally in my travels, I would meet people who bought into the story to protect and preserve, but they were seasonals year in and year out for years and years and years. And they were all different colors, so it wasn't socioeconomic or racial based. It was more or less the Park Service visitation spiked from May to August. So they literally would hire people just for those months, and then your job would be over. But of course, moving into adulthood out of my student jobs, I wanted something that was a little more stable. So then I accepted a 4-year term. So I was at Dr. King's house for 4 years. But of course, that's the reason why GYF and a lot of conservation companies, the work that they're doing is moving students from seasonal to, they call them 4-year terms, to permanent. And I know that's a big part of this development. How do we take students from those active seasonal positions to convert them to DHAs or to permanent positions? I'm the poster child of that. So that was kind of my road.
Wow, that's
Yep.
huge. Thank you so much, Shatiba, for sharing. Can you
Well,
talk about the transition between going from a ranger to management? What's that like?
Yes, great question. So for me, my supervisor, her name is Melissa English Rice. She's a cultural resource officer for the Park Service. She told me the story essentially like this, that the Park Service is the fun part of the government. Everyone wants to just literally look on your schedule and you just go out and talk to people. So with that, with a fun, enjoyable job is a lot of competitiveness. So literally the great new Sami hadn't happened yet. So there wasn't a great emergence of people retiring. So literally it's almost you had to wait your turn to be that permanent ranger. So it's either you want to wait 10 years or move into a different branch. So for me, fire and aviation was my next stop. So I became a training specialist, and I would go out to wildfires all over the country, from Mexico to California to Oregon, to work as a person who would track the fire, the resources, which are the people on the fire, and make sure that you were matched up with qualified people. And you would have a list of certifications, and I would track those certifications. So it was taking me out of my realm, but I was still in the Park Service. But I realized that if I wanted to advance and go further, I had to move out of that direct facing position as a park ranger. So it was my first love in a sense, but it wasn't any upward mobility.
Okay.
Yep.
So you had to make a pretty significant sacrifice to get a much
Yes.
larger victory.
Yes.
Okay. That's huge. Can you talk about really what it means to see such difference between the fall and the summer months? I know there's a large visitation spike and a large work spike, but what is that experience like when you're at a park in the middle of Atlanta that's getting a lot of traffic?
Yeah. So when I worked at Dr. King's house, we have clickers on all the doors, all the major venues, such as this gravesite, and those kind of track visitation. And when I left there, they were receiving over 1 million visitors a year. So literally, when you would get to work, you do 30-minute tours on the life and birth of Dr. Martin Luther King between the years of 1929 and 1941. So you kind of would just memorize that in this whole story of his life, but you would do it 30 times a day. So it was very tiring, because also you're wearing gray and green uniform, and it's hot, and you have to wear the hat. So there is a standard of which you dress yourself when you're outside. So you have to have your head covered with your hat. You have to have on, it doesn't matter if it's hot, and we know it's hot here in April, you're still in maybe your winter gear. So there is literally a act that's made by the superintendent when you can change into your summer uniform versus your winter uniform. And of course that is so for uniformity. So you want everyone to look the same. But it was very eye-opening. I've received a lot of apologies from people who would come up to me and apologize for their ancestors. You would console a lot of people after being expired by the visitor center, and they would come up to me and say, their grandmother did this, their grandfather did this, and for their family, they're apologizing to me as a person of color. So it was very humbling, because I know, of course, that that person may not have taken place in that time period, but they were a part of the solution. And also during different rights that maybe nothing to do with the civil rights, we would be on the receiving end. So of course, whether it was gay rights, it will come to Atlanta. And of course, by definition, civil rights are people's rights. So a lot of these struggles that are current today, people would align with the civil rights and come there looking for that acceptance. So we were also not just public speakers, but on the side of responding to people with humility and just listen to people's stories. So not just public speaking, but also learning how to listen to and be responsive to visitors.
Right, truly telling that narrative from the
Yes.
less objective end. Okay, so my one last question is, what was the transition from going and being a ranger to actually putting out fires, and what's that process like, and what kind of work do you have to prepare yourself for
Okay.
to experience that and to actually excel?
Well, first, I like to just thank the atmosphere, always aligning up people that were always in my path and my journey, and I didn't even know it, but they're already placed in my journey to kind of intercede on my behalf. So I had a supervisor that literally, when I came into the position, was an old Black gentleman named Larry Samuel. He's a man of two first names. And he told me this was his last couple of years working before he retires. And his last act was to help push people forward. So even though my job title didn't explain the length of all the great things, he would avail himself. So I was availed to any training that my mind could imagine. So he literally, he told me I should take the first class to work on fire. So literally I went to New Mexico, and I took my first class. And from there I had to take, even though I'm not working on the fire, you have to take training in the event if you're in a fire, how to you cover. So I would have to go to Chattahoochee and learn how to deploy a shelter. And you hear about the firemen, I think it was the 14 firemen that died in that big fire. So you have to deploy your shelter. So that was kind of the training, but I've never went to one. So my first instance of going to one, I flew out to California. I worked at McAllen Air Force Base in Sacramento, California. And there was a lady named Susan there. And this is another part of the story where people are already in your path. You have no idea. So she was a director for the Forest Service in Atlanta a few years prior. So when I came there, I didn't realize that I had to camp out. And when you work on fires, you work for 14 days and then you're off 2 days. So my days were 16-hour days. And my plan was, coming from the South, I wasn't going to camp out. I was going to sleep under my desk and then wake up in the morning, go to the shower trailer, and it's all trailers, you're out in the middle of nowhere, and start my day. And she said, Shatiba, I know this is new to you. Let me just put you in a hotel. So she put me in a hotel, and I literally had a car. Of course, I had a government credit card, so I could just rent the car and just drive to and from my work site every day. But through that experience, I helped write the guide to California training manual. So she was a training specialist for Sacramento, and that all came from the affiliation of her time in Atlanta, Georgia. So I was thankful because every step along the way, there were people put in my path. So the take home from that is I've always matched myself up with people who know more than me. It's not always good to be the smartest person in the room. So I've always availed myself to learn from other people and people who've been there before I've been there. I've always been the only person of color in many of those spaces. So what I had to learn is that some of the information wasn't going to come from people like me. But I realized there are a lot of good people with good intentions that could help me and guide me along the way. And so those are just a few people. And through that was my first experience. And from there, I worked on the oil spill for over 100 days. I worked, many fires in Texas as a training specialist. So I wasn't actually on the fire, but I was a part of the resources that managed the fires.
Wow, that's pivotal. I didn't know that, Shatiba.
Yeah.
It's fantastic learning about you.
Oh.
Just to kind of make sure that we covered all our bases, was there any major adversity or negativity from the Park Service end while you were traversing through these different positions?
I think when you work in places, honestly, coming from the South, I've never felt racism. And I know that's probably, unbelievable for some people, but I grew up in a small town and had a great childhood, college years, grad school. But when I moved to Boston, when you work for the National Park Service there, they literally have the oldest ship. It's called Old Ironside, and it sits right across in the Charles River. So the Navy barracks are the housing, and your housing is like $50 every 2 weeks. So literally you would take a water shuttle across the Charles River to your office downtown. So of course it was just the best. So as I'm coming out of the dormitory, I'm called the N-word. And at first I was like, is he talking to me? So what I realized is that sometimes it's just geographic. So you're coming from the South thinking that the South is a hotbed for racism, but it really was the North. So my experience with the North is that it was actually a little harder to work with people of different races and creeds and cultures, and it's because of their bias against Southerners. But it wasn't my colleagues and coworkers. I think with my coworkers, it was more just the wit for wit, because a lot of these positions is really how much can you learn, attain, and also regurgitate. So it's like who knows the most. I felt like the Park Service is really good with preparing students, and it's really up to the student to prepare yourself to go out and tell the story. It's about so many books and manuals and websites that you can read, but how can you take that information and tell the masses? And not just that, but invoke stewardship. So that was something I had to learn early, not just learning the story, but how to tell the story.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Shatiba. That was incredibly insightful.
You're welcome.
Cameron, do you have any questions on your end?
Yeah, so one of the things I was curious about was could you relate what your experiences have been working in the public sphere of the environmental sector versus working in the private sphere?
Yes. So I would say that over the last month, I've met with you guys more than I ever have, and I'm grateful for that. But this is pretty standard in the government. I realize there's so much red tape. Literally, I would work with grants, and I would give out grants to rural fire departments that backed up national parks. And there's so much red tape. Literally, it would go up to Congress and the Senate, and just to say yes or no. So I realized that bureaucratic red tape you hear about, that is a real thing, versus nonprofits and for-profit is really just going through your chain of command and asking your supervisor, and it's just that. So I appreciate the processes that Greening Youth Organization has put into play with going through certain parameters to how things are done, whether financial, whether IT, whether with BYU and programs that you've worked with. But I feel like the government, it almost takes an act of Congress to have something done. So with that, there becomes a morale issue of why does it take so many people to sign off something? Or, for example, I sat in the 2020 vision meeting for the Park Service, and they literally, they pulled together a lot of different people from different backgrounds, different thought processes, to see what was the mission of the vision of the Park Service in 2020. And this is something they brought in consultants. It was something that they wanted everyone in the Park Service to sit in. And at the end of the day, it was just your thoughts, because they still hired someone to write their new mission for 2020. So it's those type of things. So I can appreciate how we conduct business versus how, the government conducts business.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
And another question that I had was I really want to ask you about more so the difficulty of the transition of like moving from the US to the North. I know you talked about it just a little bit then, but even like some of like the smaller things in terms of, just how it felt to be in a different city that was pretty much outside of your comfort zone, like you're transitioning climates. So how did you make that adjustment?
It took a lot. Like, I'm the youngest of my family, so to put me on a plane and to wave at me at Hartsfield Jackson, like, bye, 22 years old. I graduated from college with my bachelor's degree when I was 21 years old. I graduated May 4th. I was on a plane June 1st. And I was being picked up from the airport from a stranger. So I really identified with that BYU assessment of internship experiences, because I felt very lonely. I felt isolated. A lot of those topics that they hit, and I realized that it was just little stuff, like I didn't talk like they talked. I didn't really look like they looked. So I felt like, will they laugh at me when I talk? Do I sound Southern? So it was a little bit of that. So I was like, I'm not just going to talk, because I don't want them to know I'm not from here, And then there are some biases. You see the North, it's like, am I going to get robbed? Is it safe for me as a single woman? Can I walk? So those things. So I think the adjustment was just me. I say it was kind of my rights to womanhood. So it was my first time being on my own. And even though if it was a dormitory, I had my own phone, I kind of could venture out. So that was a big thing, just discovering who I was simultaneously as coming into a new career. So I think if you kind of have a handle of who you are, you don't get lost in the sauce. My biggest thing was like, just trying all the food. Boston is from the South, it was grits, soul food, Mexican food, maybe Chinese food. But when I went to Boston, it really opened my eyes up to all the different types of people and the food. And, here, either you're black, you're white, or other. And you kind of fall into those. There is like, you're not white. Are you German American? Are you Irish American? You're not just black. Are you Cape Verdean? Are you Haitian? So it really made me discover, who am I? Where did I come from? So it was really a rites of passage. And I'm thankful for that because, like I said, I'm from a town of under 100,000 people. I can count the amount of stoplights, 3 high schools, 2 elementary schools. So the first time I was on the plane was to go to my first duty station. So I don't think if it was for that, when I graduated, I probably would have just taken a position in my hometown and just lived in, hometown USA on Main Street. So it really was an eye opener. And that's why I chose it, because nowhere else could a person like myself just move anywhere in the country, because I knew they had 2 things. I knew they had housing, and I know they probably had a travel budget. So they literally like, Shatiba, just go to the airport. So I put down my ideas of loneliness and isolation, and I just, I took the bull by the horns, and the rest is history.
Wow. I mean, that really speaks to, I guess, the importance of just like getting out and sort of seeing the world, because it sounds
Yes.
like it was super scary at first, but then you
Super
came out like
scary.
all the better because of it.
Yes, I sold my first car to fund my trips because I didn't have anything. And then when I asked my parents, could they help me? Because there was 2 siblings ahead of me. So I was like, I had a Honda Accord, and I was like, it's old. And I've heard that Boston is a walking city. So I was like, I'll just sell the car, have a couple $1,000s. So it took a sacrifice, for me. It's just like, okay, I don't know what it's going to behold. And as I stated earlier, these are seasonal positions. So what am I going to do after the season? But luckily for me, Dr. King's house had an opening, and also Tuskegee. And, as I spoke about earlier, there were always people along the journey. Because the thing about, I realized, government agencies, particularly the Park Service, there are not a lot of brown faces. So when you see one, you kind of pull them in, and you kind of give them the behind the scenes story. So I was always thankful for those people who pull me in to give me those behind the scenes tidbits of what I should look for, what I should do. And that's kind of why I ventured out into fire, because if there were no brown faces in front facing positions, there are absolutely none in fire. So it really made the difference.
Gotcha.
Yep.
And so my last question for you was going to be, so what would you recommend for interns who are looking to break into the field, especially as people of color? Like, what would you recommend that they do? Really just in terms of what to look out for, figuring out what positions might want to
Mm-hmm.
be for them, and things like switching from one position like you did in Boston
Mm-hmm.
back to Dr. King's house.
Mm-hmm.
So really, yeah, overall, like what tips would you give them to look out for?
My tips for current students would be to avail yourself. I'm really big on mentorships. I've always had a mentor, no matter how old I get. Also, I always look on USA Jobs at the time to see what was available. For recent graduates, that is also a direct hiring authority. So you have presidential scholars, you have recent hires, and you also have current students. And also just calling people. I think technology has taken over, so you don't really get those phone calls. So a lot of the positions I secured, I literally just looked and said, hey, I'm a student. Can I send you my transcript? Do you have positions? And the old fashioned way still works. Because other than the work we do as GYF, there are a lot of students just in limbo. They don't know how to reach the unreachable Park Service or any other government agency. So my advice would be just to avail yourself to seek out a mentor, and also, keep abreast to, current trends in hiring. We know the great new Usami is coming, aka 30 to 40% of the federal population, baby boomers, are retiring. So it's not by chance we see all these directorate programs coming out for Fish and Wildlife, the National Park Service, and all these other organizations, because there's an educational gap that's going on. People are retiring and millennials are coming into the workforce. But if we know it takes a GS 15 to 20 years to become fully certified at the top tier of their position, that means that we don't have 20 years to train someone that's 22 years old straight out of Spelman. They don't want entry level people. So my idea is to avail yourself. And of course, my quote that I live by is that, when you come to the path and it's divided, always take the path that's less traveled. And that's kind of been the success that I've had. I could have done a lot of different careers. Like I said, my initial track, I went to Howard to be a physician assistant. My interest was in biology. I thought about maybe going to another country. I was going to take the Foreign Service exam to go over and study malaria in other countries. But I realized when you really looked at the whole picture, I just want to be a servant. I want to help people. So, we're coming out of the generation where you have to be a doctor or a lawyer. So I think as we evolve, we can now tell our cousins and sisters and brothers, you can be a park ranger, you can be a land manager, you can be an archaeologist. So I know as you guys grew up, we didn't hear about a lot of those terms. I know for me, it was like go to medical school, go to law school, go to veterinarian school. So I think, as things change, we can be the change we want to see because now we're telling our story. So that's kind of my advice, just to avail yourself and to be open.
Very well said.
Thank you, guys.
That was hugely informative. Thank you.
Right.
And fast.